Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
A millionaire let a homeless girl secretly spend the night in his dying wife's hospital room. "She doesn't care anymore, you can stay," he said. But when he came back in the morning, he couldn't believe his eyes. The millionaire stormed into the private clinic corridor, shattering the silence with heavy steps and a sharp shout. "Stop her! She shouldn't be here." Francisco Ponce, a tall, imposing man of about 39, usually appeared at the hospital in a tailored suit, radiating cold confidence. But today, his tie was askew, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned, and his eyes filled with anxiety. Word had reached him that a small homeless girl, around 5 years old, was wandering the clinic, dressed in a tattered coat, barefoot in worn-out shoes, her hair a tangled mess. She darted through the corridors like she was searching for safety. In this elite medical center, visitors like her weren't just unwelcome, they were unimaginable. 2 large, uniformed security guards had already surrounded the girl. She had shrunk back against the wall, pressing herself into the cold tiles, seemingly frozen in fear. Francisco quickly approached, shooting a look at his employees. "Step aside. I'll handle this." The guards moved back, giving him space. The girl was trembling, her pale face peeking out from behind tangled dark blonde hair. She wasn't what you'd call beautiful by common standards, but her wide eyes held a whole world of suffering and unspoken wisdom. Francisco crouched down, trying not to seem threatening, and spoke gently. "Hey there, sweetheart. What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here without permission." The girl sobbed softly, clutching a dirty, one-eyed plush doll to her chest, probably her only possession. I'm cold," she murmured, tears falling down her cheeks. He slowly reached out his hand, but she flinched hard against the wall, as if expecting to be grabbed and thrown out. Francisco saw her lip trembling, her eyes darting nervously. Deep down, he knew he should call the police or social services. But something in him stirred. He remembered that in this very clinic, on the 3rd floor, his wife lay dying from an incurable illness. Her name was Johanna. The doctors had long given up. The best treatments, the millions Francisco had paid, it all seemed like a drop in the ocean against fate. Machines kept her alive, but there had been almost no improvement. Francisco gave a crooked smile to himself. On one side, a dying wife in a luxury clinic room, on the other, a 5-year-old street child who had clearly sneaked in. The guards exchanged questioning glances. Should they forcibly remove the girl, or wait for further instructions? Francisco stayed crouched. "Are you alone?" he asked softly. "Yes. I had a mom, she whispered. "She died when I was little." Her eyes filled with sorrow. "I never had a dad." The word never hit like a bitter sentence. Francisco bit his lip, looking at the fragile, terrified little being before him. He had once funded charity projects and donated to children's homes, but he had never faced such hopelessness in a child's eyes up close. "What's your name?" he asked almost in a whisper. "Elena," she said, rubbing her dirty cheek with her hand, leaving a smudge. "All right, Elena," Francisco nodded. "Do you know where you are?" She shook her head. "I was just walking. Thought it might be warm here. I'm so cold. And scared. Out there, people scream and dogs bark. And sometimes, someone might hit you. I saw a man get beat up just for standing near a trash bin." Her voice cracked, tears welling up again. Francisco's heart clenched. He felt ashamed of his earlier anger. Seeing her like this, he made a decision. "Take her to the staff break room," he ordered the guards. "Feed her. Give her some warm tea." The men exchanged glances. This wasn't in their job description, and Francisco was known for being strict. Usually, a person like this would be thrown out without question. But now, they just nodded. "All right, Mr. Francisco." The girl didn't seem to fully grasp what was happening. She flinched when a guard stepped forward, but Francisco reassured her. "Don't be afraid. They won't hurt you." He watched as they led her down the corridor. What am I doing? Flashed through his mind. But then he thought, at least this once, he would act with compassion. After all, the hospital was partly his, he was its major investor. So he had the right to show mercy. But soon his thoughts returned to his greatest sorrow, his wife. He needed to go up to the third floor and check with her doctor, Lucia. Francisco took the elevator and was immediately greeted by the familiar, suffocating smell of medications and disinfectants, the scent of recent months. When he entered Johanna's room, she lay nearly motionless. Machines buzzed quietly, monitor lines flickering faintly. He hadn't seen her yet that day, having been out at a meeting. He sat on the edge of her bed and took her thin hand. She barely opened her eyes. "You came," she whispered. It was more a breath than a voice, but Francisco heard every word. He bowed his head. "Of course, I'm here. Sorry I wasn't here this morning. How are you?" She didn't respond. Or perhaps she did, too faintly to hear. Francisco glanced at the machines, but there was nothing encouraging. For weeks, the doctors had described her condition as consistently critical, no improvement, but no steep decline either. Just a slow fading. Despite his wealth and power, Francisco felt utterly helpless. Should he tell Johanna about the girl he met? Or was Johanna past caring? He remembered how she used to smile at the sight of children. She had always dreamed of having one, had even wanted to adopt if she couldn't conceive. And now, she lay here, unmoving, while a frightened 5-year-old waited downstairs. Francisco gave a bitter smile. What irony. Hang in there, Johanna. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes again, as if drifting into sleep. A head nurse entered and asked softly, "Mr. Francisco, will you be staying the night?" Francisco was about to nod, but then remembered the girl. "I'll go back downstairs for a bit, then return," he said. "Please take good care of my wife." The nurse nodded with understanding, and Francisco left. In the hallway, he ran into Johanna's doctor, Lucia, a short, composed woman with a serious expression. They exchanged glances. "No change," she said tiredly. "We're continuing the treatment, but—" "I know," Francisco interrupted, not wanting to hear the usual speech about how there were practically no medical chances. 10 minutes later, he was already heading to the staff break room, where the nurses usually drank tea and chatted. And there, on an old couch, he saw the same little homeless girl, now wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea from a large mug. A resident doctor who happened to be there told him the girl had been given a sandwich and an apple, which she devoured hungrily, and now she was sitting quietly, flinching at every sound. Francisco approached. The girl looked at him cautiously, as if not believing that this dignified man had shown her compassion. "Did they feed you?" he asked. "Yes." "Thank you," she answered. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, clearly from long exposure to the cold and illness. "Elena, right?" "Yes." She fell silent again. Francisco drifted into thought. A battle raged within him, to turn her out, because this elite clinic was no place for the homeless. There could be backlash, not to mention potential infection. But the image of his wife upstairs wouldn't leave his mind. He remembered how Johanna had helped in orphanages in her younger years, volunteering her time. If she could speak now, surely she'd say, "Let the child stay." Help her, Francisco thought. "What am I going to do with you?" he muttered. Elena sniffled and hugged her doll. "I didn't know I wasn't allowed in." "I'm sorry. I was just looking for a place to stay, just one night." The sight was heartbreaking. She was so skinny, she looked tiny under the blanket. By the book, he should call child services. But Francisco clenched his fists, recalling closed shelters and hearing stories about what those places were like. Kids often ran away from them. "All right," he sighed. "You can stay for now. I won't throw you out in the middle of the night. It's late anyway. But where will we put you?" He paused, realizing the only possible place was either the staff utility room or his wife's private suite, with its separate cushioned lounger. Johanna was dying, and it seemed she no longer cared. He hadn't planned to bring a child into a sterile room, but suddenly he was overwhelmed by a sense of desperation. What if? Every time I look at Johanna, there's only fog in her eyes. But this girl, maybe she'll bring even a flicker of light. Francisco turned to Elena. Come with me. But you must be very quiet. There's a very sick woman there. She's my wife. Elena flinched and nodded. Okay. I'll be quiet. If the lady is very sick, does it hurt her a lot? Francisco wanted to say yes, but he knew it was too hard to explain to a child. Together, they made their way upstairs. Francisco led her down the corridor, worried someone, nurses or administrators, would stop them. But everyone was busy with their own routines. When they entered the room, he motioned for Elena to stay near the door and approached his wife's bed. Johanna lay with open eyes, her gaze foggy and unfocused. Hearing footsteps, she turned her head with effort. I brought a girl, Francisco said in a low voice, unsure if Johanna could even hear him. She's homeless and has nowhere to go. I thought, there's a soft couch here, and since it doesn't matter anymore. I'm sorry. His hands clenched involuntarily. Johanna used to be his anchor, his support, his best friend. Now all he hoped for was that she could still hear him. Suddenly, her lips parted slightly, and she whispered, Let her. Francisco's heart clenched. So, she was still aware. Meanwhile, Elena tiptoed inside. She was about to cry. The sight of a sick woman surrounded by machines frightened her. But a child's compassion overpowered her fear, and she whispered, Hello. Johanna slightly opened her eyes and looked at the girl. She tried to smile but couldn't muster the strength. It's okay, Francisco said softly. Just stay quiet. Sit on that couch. If you want something to drink, there's water on the table. I'll stay here with her for now. Elena looked around, swallowed nervously, and crept over to the cushioned divan like a frightened animal. The wooden legs were ornate. This furniture had been custom made. She sat carefully, afraid to break or dirty anything. The night passed in anguish. Francisco barely slept, occasionally dozing off in the chair beside the bed. Elena stirred in her sleep a few times, crying out, but tried to stay quiet. Early in the morning, when Francisco opened his eyes, he noticed his wife looking at something. Following her gaze, he saw Elena standing by the bed, gently holding Johanna's hand as if afraid to cause pain. At that moment, Johanna looked at the girl with intent, as if speaking through her eyes. She still couldn't manage a full sentence, but her face seemed warmer. Francisco stood slowly, stunned. The girl wasn't afraid of the wires and tubes. She was carefully touching Johanna's thin fingers. And Johanna, who had barely reacted to anything in weeks, now moved her lips slightly. What's your name? Her voice was raspy and faint, but the words were clear. Elena met her gaze. I'm Elena. Elena, Johanna repeated, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Francisco exhaled sharply. He hadn't seen Johanna speak so clearly, or cry, in a long time. She usually lay in a silent, pain-soaked daze, barely reacting to anyone. My God, he whispered. She's speaking better today. He exchanged glances with Elena. The girl gave him a timid smile. Francisco, I think the lady is still sick, but she can hear me. Francisco's heart ached. He glanced at the monitors. Readings were still low, but stable. Maybe it was just a temporary flash of awareness. Or maybe, just maybe, there was still something left inside his wife. A few minutes later, the duty nurse Carmen entered, a tall, kind-eyed blonde. She greeted Francisco, noticed the girl, and raised an eyebrow, but chose not to ask questions. She was used to the unique situation of this patient and the fact that Francisco essentially ran the place. Carmen performed her usual checkup, changed the 4, noted some readings, then asked quietly, Francisco, would you like some coffee? Yes, please, he nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his bones. And something for the girl too, tea or juice. Elena shook her head. Thank you. I'm not hungry right now. All right, I'll leave some tea here anyway, Carmen smiled. When she left, a brief silence followed. Johanna seemed to have dozed off again, or perhaps the sudden surge of strength had exhausted her. Francisco gently called. Johanna? She didn't respond. Elena sighed, stepped back to the couch, and hugged her doll tighter. Watching her movements, Francisco frowned. Listen, Elena, he said. How long have you been on the streets? Since summer, she admitted. I ran away from the orphanage. There, her lips trembled, the boys were mean to me. And the caregiver hit me sometimes too. I don't want to go back. I'd rather be on the streets. Francisco ran a hand over his face. It was terrifying to even think that a child could be beaten in an orphanage. On the other hand, an orphanage is at least a state institution, however imperfect. But here she was, wandering the streets. 5 years old, completely alone. So you came into the hospital to warm up, he guessed. Yes. The doors downstairs weren't locked. I hid and wanted to sleep in the hallway. Then the security guards found me. A heartbreaking story, unfortunately, not uncommon. Francisco began to wonder what to do. Right now, his main goal was to help his wife, and he had no time to deal with custody paperwork. But he also couldn't throw the girl back out on the street. He felt cornered by his conscience and the situation. All right, he muttered. You can stay here for now. We'll see. That same day, he gave instructions to his security team not to disturb the girl, to allow her to stay in the room and walk the corridor with staff supervision. He also called his assistant, Martin. Find me information about orphanages, foster services. See if there's a place we can send the child where she won't be mistreated. The assistant promised to look into it. Francisco felt like he was taking a reckless step, but he had no choice anymore. Over the next few days, it turned out that Johanna's condition, while still serious, showed slight improvement. Doctors noted some stabilization in her blood pressure, and she began opening her eyes more often and trying to speak. There was no way to confirm if this was because of the girl. Coincidences happen, and the medication continued, but Francisco, a skeptic by nature, was beginning to believe that the child was giving his wife a strange kind of emotional energy, awakening a flicker of the will to live. Meanwhile, Elena slowly settled into life at the hospital. She slept on the couch, adapting to the hospital schedule. In the morning, Nurse Carmen would bring her a bun, warm up some porridge, and offer apples. Francisco gave orders to buy her clothes, and within a few days, she was cleaned up, her hair washed, checked by a pediatrician for any serious illnesses. The doctor concluded that she was malnourished and anemic, but not terminally ill. She needed proper food, care, and a calm environment. Whispers spread through the clinic. There's a kid living in the VIP room? What kind of luxury is this? But most doctors and nurses, seeing Elena, were touched. She was obedient, kind, and quiet. She didn't disturb anyone and watched everything with wide, curious eyes. When Johanna was awake, Elena would sit by her bedside and tell little stories in her soft voice, about seeing a ginger cat near a dumpster, about hiding from the rain in a basement, or about wanting to find the hospital where her mother had died so she could be closer to her. Francisco would quietly listen to these stories, clenching his jaw, feeling a mix of pity and sorrow. He saw that Johanna was listening, her lips moved, trying to express sympathy, though her speech was weak and came out only in whispers. Even the doctors noted she seemed a bit more alert. One day, Lucia came up to Francisco and said, "Listen, I don't want to give false hope, but we are seeing some improvement in her awareness. It may be temporary, or maybe something inside her has been triggered. Sometimes a positive mindset or emotional shock can help patients. But with a condition this severe, well," she hesitated, unsure whether to add, "don't expect too much." Francisco nodded. "I understand. Thank you, Lucia." But inside, he felt a quiet joy. Though a realist, he was starting to see glimmers of hope. And so life in the hospital went on. Francisco bounced between his firm and his wife's room, managing endless calls and spending every free moment by Johanna's side. Elena would sit nearby, and when she sensed his despair, she would crawl up beside him, rest her head on his knee, and whisper, "Johanna will get better. I know it." In those moments, he realized how much hope children can give, even when adults see things through a colder lens. But on the third day of their time together, Francisco faced a new problem. Child Protective Services showed up at the hospital. It was a prestigious clinic, and of course, it couldn't remain a secret for long that a runaway child was living in a VIP room. Someone on the junior staff had either leaked the information or accidentally mentioned it. Two women in formal suits demanded an explanation. This child had no ID, no registration, and needed to be placed under state care immediately. "No improvisation," said the older woman with a short haircut. "You don't have the right to keep a child here. How did this even happen?" Francisco crossed his arms in the hallway. "Keep her? She was living on the street. Do you understand that she was abused in the orphanage? She didn't run away for no reason. And here, she's finally safe. Yes, it's an unusual situation, but—" "No buts," the official interrupted. "This is emotional sentiment. The child needs to be in an orphanage or with an official guardian. If you want to apply for custody, do it the proper way. In the meantime, we're taking the child." Elena, who had been standing behind him, turned pale as a sheet when she saw the stern women. She clutched Francisco's sleeve desperately. Her eyes screamed, "Please, don't let them take me." "Stop," Francisco said firmly, feeling anger rise. "I'm willing to handle all the legal procedures. But please, give me a few days. My wife is critically ill. This isn't a simple situation. And I won't allow you to take Elena without considering her well-being." "Your wife," one of the officials began, but stopped when she saw Francisco's knuckles turn white. "All right, we'll give you time, but not a week. Just a few days. The child can't live in the hospital indefinitely." 2 weeks, Francisco said through clenched teeth, trying to remain polite. "At least 2 weeks. I'll find a proper orphanage with decent conditions and file for temporary custody." The women exchanged disapproving glances. One tried to object, but the other said, "Fine, 2 weeks. But if you haven't sorted things out by then, we'll have to take her. There's a committee that inspects conditions, and all that." Francisco nodded, though inside he was boiling. Elena, seeing this, hid behind him and clung to his leg. When the women left, saying they'd return, Francisco turned to the girl and saw she was on the verge of tears. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't want to go back to the orphanage. It hurts there." "I'll do everything I can to make sure you don't go back," he said grimly, looking into her eyes. "Do you hear me, Elena?" She only nodded, not knowing how else to respond. At that moment, Nurse Carmen walked by with a folder. Seeing the grim scene, she asked sympathetically, "Francisco, is everything all right?" He briefly explained that child services had come. Carmen frowned. "This could be difficult. But you're a powerful man. I'm sure you'll find a way to give that girl a real home." "Yes," he said bitterly. "But I need to figure out how and what to do." And also, he abruptly cut himself off, glancing at Elena. "Everything will be fine." He needed time to sort things out. So when he returned to the room and saw that Johanna had come to a little, he decided to talk to her, if she was able to follow the conversation. She was staring at the ceiling, and when he approached, she tried to focus. "Johanna, can you hear me?" She gave a barely perceptible nod. He sat down next to her, took her hand, and leaned in. "If you could speak," he began, then continued anyway, seeing she was at least somewhat responsive. "There's this girl, Elena. You know, she's been living here with us for several days now. I think I want to take custody of her. Or at least take her in, because she—" He hesitated. It was hard to admit, but he felt a strange kinship with the girl. And his wife had once dreamed of adopting a child. What would you think about that? A foolish question she couldn't answer properly. But unexpectedly, Johanna managed to whisper, "Don't let her go." "The girl," he guessed. Johanna gave a tiny nod. A smile flickered on her lips. Her eyes warmed. In that moment, she said more than she had in weeks. Francisco understood. Even lying on the edge of life and death, Johanna was still trying to show that deep compassion she had always possessed. His heart felt lighter. She wasn't against it. He stroked her hair gently. "All right, Johanna. I'll do my best." That same evening, he returned to his office and gathered his legal team for an urgent meeting. "We need to file for temporary custody of a 5-year-old girl. She has no parents. She ran away from a state orphanage." "What's the procedure?" The lawyers exchanged glances and began explaining the bureaucratic steps. "File an application with Child Protective Services, gather proof of income, proof of housing, medical reports for the potential guardians. You'll need your wife's consent, a medical evaluation of her condition, which complicates things, as she's severely ill. There are many nuances." "How long will it take?" Francisco asked, frowning impatiently. "Usually a few months, if everything goes smoothly. But with your resources and connections, we can expedite things. Still, it will take at least a couple of weeks." Francisco cursed silently. Exactly the 2 weeks he had negotiated. He'd have to act fast, use every connection he had in the system. "All right, get on it immediately." "I will not let them take the girl," he said through clenched teeth. The next day, Elena noticed that Francisco had brought a stack of papers and was signing them right there in the hospital room. She sat down next to him. "What's that?" "Documents," Francisco replied with a smile. "I want you to live with me. And with my wife, when she gets better, understand? I need these papers so no one can separate us." Elena tilted her head. "Do you really want that?" For a moment, he was caught off guard by the question. A powerful wave of emotion rose in him. Yes, he did want that. For the first time in many years, he felt with total clarity that he was making the right decision. "Yes, Elena, I do." She smiled and hesitantly touched his hand, as if afraid this was all just a dream. That very night, Johanna's condition made a surprising turn for the better. With the nurse's help, she managed to sit up in bed and even uttered a few short sentences without slurring all the words. The doctors came, astonished. Though her overall condition was still serious, it seemed like a glimmer of recovery. Francisco couldn't believe his eyes when he saw her trying to bring a cup of water to her lips by herself. "Johanna, this is a miracle," he whispered. She looked down and said softly, "I want to live." To him, those words were a sign to keep fighting. He hugged her tightly, even though she was still hooked up to wires and monitors. A piercing jolt shot through his heart. Yes, they had to keep fighting. Elena had been watching the scene silently, mesmerized. Then she came closer and asked, "Johanna, if you get better, can I call you Mom?" Johanna gave a faint smile, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Of course," she whispered. "Of course." But the fairy tale couldn't go on without obstacles. A few days later, just as everyone had begun to rejoice at the slight improvement, Johanna suffered a severe setback. Her body reacted badly to a new round of strong medication. That night, her temperature spiked and her blood pressure plummeted. Doctors rushed into the room, ordering Elena to leave immediately so she wouldn't interfere. The girl didn't want to be alone in the corridor, so a nurse took her to a neighboring room. Francisco stayed behind as they fought the complications through the night. By morning, Johanna was very weak again, back in a semi-conscious state. The whole clinic was in a stir. Lucia canceled part of the medication regimen, ordered new infusions. Francisco sat by her side, holding her hand, fearing this might be the end. That all their hopes had just been an illusion and the illness was taking over again. Elena quietly entered the room and approached Johanna. Seeing the woman's pale face and closed eyes, the nurse Carmen tried to stop the girl. "She's not well right now," Let's go. But Francisco gestured for her to let Elena stay. The girl walked up to the bed, laid her small hand on Johanna's, gently touched it, and whispered, "I don't want you to die. Please." And in that moment, Johanna slightly opened her eyes. Very slowly, as if from immense weakness, but she did. She looked at Elena. With great effort, she raised her trembling hand, as if trying to caress her. She said no words, but that small reaction brought a spark of hope. Francisco, witnessing this, felt both relief and fear. She was still with them, but how long would her strength last? The next day, the doctor said they needed a medical board, new tests, and possibly a consultation with international experts. Francisco, sparing no expense, agreed to everything. He ordered his assistants to contact a renowned European professor, send medical files, test results, and seek advice. And while all these processes were set in motion, the hours and days blurred into an endless state of anxiety. Elena had become a true beacon of light for both Francisco and Johanna. But life isn't a melodrama where everything is solved with one lucky break. Still, the girl remained in the hospital. A week had passed. She spent nights in the room, ate in the staff cafeteria, and the doctors continued to turn a blind eye. Once or twice, child welfare inspectors came again, raising their voices that this was no place for a child. But when they saw frail little Elena, with nowhere else to go, and that Francisco was actively working on custody, they left grumbling but granted more time. One day, unexpectedly, a journalist came to visit the hospital. She had apparently heard rumors about the strange story of a wealthy man and a homeless girl. Francisco met her in the hallway. At first, he wanted to chase her off, but the woman, about 30, holding a voice recorder, pleaded, "Please, just give a comment. It's such an unusual case. A powerful businessman takes in a girl right in the hospital. People want to know, can something like this really happen?" Francisco answered grimly, "I don't care what people are interested in. I'm doing what I believe is right. Please leave the building." The journalist tried to follow him, talking about possible public support. He cut her off. No comments. So far, no articles about the story had appeared in the press. Francisco didn't want everything to turn into a sensation. Meanwhile, Johanna's recovery was progressing very slowly. The doctor consulted from Germany proposed a treatment plan that could offer a chance. But that meant preparing the patient either for transport to a foreign clinic or asking the professor to fly in. Francisco was ready to pay for anything, as long as it could save his wife. One evening, as Elena was getting ready for bed and Johanna was lightly dozing under sedation, Francisco was sitting in the same hospital room, reviewing guardianship paperwork on his laptop. The girl came up to him hesitantly. "Francisco?" "Yes, sweetheart." He looked up at her, tired. "And if Aunt Johanna doesn't get better, will you send me away?" The question hit him like a blow. Everything clenched inside him. He stood up and walked over to the couch where Elena was sitting. Kneeling in front of her, he said seriously, "No. Even if," his throat tightened, "something happens to her, I won't abandon you." Elena sniffled, wrapped her arms around his neck, and buried her nose into him. Francisco hadn't expected such a sudden gesture, but he gently hugged her back and felt her trembling. He thought about the responsibility that had landed on his shoulders. And still, there was determination inside him. "And still," he added, "we're going to hope Johanna recovers. We have to believe." The longer Elena stayed in the hospital, the closer her relationship became with the staff. But everyone understood this couldn't go on forever. Especially as child services began calling more frequently, pressing for an official solution. Francisco pushed his lawyers, who replied, "The hearing is soon. The commission will meet soon." Bureaucracy is a powerful force. During this time, Francisco opened up even more to Elena as a caring person. He asked her about her past, how she lived with her mother. Her mother had died in a regular city hospital from pneumonia when Elena was 3. No relatives were found, and the father wasn't listed in any documents. Then came the orphanage, the runaways, the wandering. Elena didn't know what a peaceful family life was. She had never had a soft bed or toys. Francisco sometimes closed his eyes while listening so she wouldn't see the tears on his lashes. Meanwhile, Johanna was slowly improving. Every new day brought small wins. She could speak for a few minutes in a weak but understandable voice. She began eating broth on her own. Her body remained weak, but the doctors and Francisco noted consistent positive progress. Everyone hoped that the long therapy and emotional support were finally working. Elena, unaware of the medical nuances, believed that Aunt Johanna would definitely get better and that they would be a family. A month passed. The Guardianship Commission finally granted Francisco temporary custody, allowing the child to live under his care while the official process continued. In that time, Elena got a modest wardrobe and learned how to properly brush her hair. Nurse Carmen taught her how to braid. The girl gained a little weight, and color returned to her face, though memories of her past still frightened her. Francisco often marveled at how Elena helped the caregivers, handing out napkins, carrying used trays to the med block, washing apples. She was only 5, yet more mature than many adults. One day, the hospital's chief doctor came in to discuss Johanna's continued stay. Seeing Elena calmly coloring in a children's corner on the floor, he shook his head. "Francisco, I understand everything, but this is a top-tier room. This breaks all internal rules. You need to decide something. How much longer can it go on?" "I am deciding," Francisco replied dryly. "I don't care what your rules say. I pay all the bills, and I'm willing to pay extra for the girl if that's the issue." The doctor raised his hands. He knew no one in the clinic could oppose Francisco, their major investor. Soon another inspection arrived, this time from the insurance company. But they only reviewed the invoices and didn't interfere with the child's situation. Francisco continued supporting his wife and consulting with German and Israeli specialists. And Johanna, step by step, was coming back to life. 2 months after Elena had arrived in the room, Johanna could now sit up, speak more clearly, hold hands, and even walk a bit around the corridor with help. Some doctors said they had never seen anything like it. "We thought she could pass any moment, and now she's improving." Of course, the illness hadn't disappeared, and the risk remained great, but now there was hope. One evening, Francisco returned to the room with joyful news. "Johanna, Elena, guess what? I've arranged for us to go to Austria. The specialists are ready to take you for rehab. Johanna, it'll give you another chance. We might have to fly in a medical plane, but I'll cover everything." Johanna looked tired but intrigued. "Austria?" "Yes. They've developed a new treatment plan there. Rehab will take at least 6 months, but if it goes well, there's a high chance of remission." "When?" she asked softly. "As soon as the doctors say it's safe to transport you. Maybe in a couple of weeks." Elena frowned slightly. "What about me? Will you take me too?" Francisco stroked her hair. "Of course we'll take you. I'm not leaving you behind." The girl beamed. Her old fears melted away. Just recently, she had worried that it was all temporary, that she'd be discarded once the kindness game ended. But Francisco's words sounded sincere. However, to take a child abroad, he needed not just temporary custody but full guardianship or adoption. Francisco urgently mobilized his lawyers, who used every connection to accelerate the process. A medical certificate was attached confirming Johanna's inability to participate in the paperwork, but her written consent was provided. The documents were finalized in record time. And finally, the day arrived. It was deemed safe to transport Johanna to the Austrian clinic. The medevac plane was waiting at the airfield. Francisco ordered Elena's passport to be issued on an expedited basis, faster for children, packed their things, papers, and money. The night before departure, he sat beside Johanna, holding her hands. "Tomorrow, the ambulance will pick us up and take us to the airport. Don't be afraid, everything is under control." Johanna nodded. "I'm not afraid. I want to live. For you, for Elena." The girl stood in the doorway, smiling. "Will we have a big airplane?" Francisco chuckled. It's not very big, but it's special, full of medical equipment. You'll like it. Maybe, if we're lucky, they'll even let you see the cockpit. Elena clapped her hands in delight. She had never flown before, had barely seen much of the world. Just a year ago, she'd been hiding under bridges, terrified of dogs. And now, she was heading to another country. Her world had turned upside down. The next morning, an entire team of doctors arrived to escort Johanna. They gently placed her on a stretcher, connected portable equipment. Elena watched as her mama Johanna was wheeled out of the room, her heart pounding in fear that maybe she wouldn't be taken with them. But then Francisco called her over. Stay close. We're together. The hospital maid, watching the scene, sniffled. Over the past 2 months, she had grown fond of the cheerful little girl who had become part of their ward, and she sincerely hoped everything would turn out well for them. Staff members who empathized with their story came out into the hallway to see them off. Dr. Lucia quietly said, "Good luck to all of you. I'm glad Johanna is in a more stable condition. I hope she completes her recovery there." "Thank you for everything," Francisco replied with a heavy heart. They headed to the airport. Boarding went relatively smoothly, though Elena was frightened by the loud roar of the engines. Johanna was secured in a special seat, and the doctors began monitoring her vital signs. The flight lasted several hours, during which Elena drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally waking up to look out at the clouds through the window. Francisco periodically approached his wife's stretcher to check in with the medical team. Vienna greeted them with overcast skies, but hope still burned within Francisco. "The main thing is that all of this isn't in vain," he kept repeating to himself. After another 30 minutes in an ambulance, they arrived at a new hospital, one that resembled a modern hotel more than a medical facility, with a friendly staff speaking English and a bit of Spanish. Initially, the plan was to place Elena in a nearby hotel, but Francisco insisted the girl stay in the same room as her mother, even if not biological. "It positively affects her psychological state," he explained. "Trust me, it's very important." The Austrian medical team, though surprised, agreed, so long as sanitary rules were followed. Francisco rented a large, private room to ensure there was enough space for everyone. The first few days were difficult. Johanna underwent extensive testing again, treatment plans were adjusted, and translation challenges arose with complex medical terms. Francisco hired a consultant and managed most of the communication himself, as he spoke decent English. Elena didn't understand everything, but she could tell the environment was different: bright hospital rooms, large windows, unfamiliar people in white coats speaking strange words. But since she was with her mom and dad, she had started calling Francisco Dad, first shyly, then more confidently. Everything felt less scary. Doctors began a new course of intensive chemotherapy, likely for an oncological disease, alongside additional treatments. Time passed, 1 week, then 2. Johanna's condition fluctuated, showing slight improvements, followed by setbacks. Francisco was exhausted. Seeing his worried face, Elena tried not to cry and worked hard to act grown-up. She often sat by her mother's bedside, holding her hand and whispering about the garden outside. "There are flowers, so bright and yellow, and birds are singing. I'll bring you a flower if I'm allowed." Sometimes she would just sit quietly, and somehow, her presence seemed to give Johanna a little strength. When there were breaks from treatment, Francisco would take Elena for short walks around the clinic grounds, pointing out tidy paths, flower beds, and trees. Elena had never seen such cleanliness and order before. Once, she scooped up a handful of soil and tossed it into the air, laughing. "Look, Dad, real dirt." It all seemed like a magical world to her. Francisco watched the child and felt his heart breaking, realizing how much she had already endured. Another 2 months passed, filled with Johanna's battle for life. At one point, she nearly died from internal bleeding in the ICU. Doctors performed emergency transfusions, and everyone teetered on the edge of despair. Elena sobbed in the hallway, clinging to Francisco like he was her only anchor. But Johanna pulled through. Slowly, her body began to adapt to the therapy. Then came the day the head physician summoned Francisco to his office. "Mr. Francisco, your wife's test results show positive progress. We can't say the illness is defeated yet, but things are moving in the right direction. She needs more time and rehabilitation, but her chances are good." Francisco nearly fainted from relief. He left the office, sat on a bench in the corridor, covered his face with his hands, and burst into tears. Elena, who had been waiting nearby, froze in surprise. "Dad, are you crying?" He sniffled and smiled. "No, Elena, I'm happy. Mommy's going to live." The girl quietly approached and hugged him, searching his face. "Really? She won't die?" "I can't promise for sure," he admitted honestly, "but the doctors say there's a good chance." From that moment, a new spirit of hope took hold in their little family. Johanna remained in the clinic, gained weight, and although her hair had thinned from chemotherapy, she was now able to walk with a cane. Her face was gaunt, but her eyes sparkled with meaning and joy. Elena helped her, bringing slippers, fetching water. The doctors noted that this little girl wasn't a distraction. On the contrary, her presence helped the patient avoid slipping into depression. As Johanna continued treatment, another 6 months passed. For a child, that felt like forever, but Elena remained by her mother's side, while Francisco managed everything, protecting both wife and daughter. He lived between two cities, often flying home briefly for business paperwork before returning. Life became an endless cycle of flights, but in his heart, Francisco knew he was fighting for the most important things, his wife's life and the child's future. Finally, the doctors announced Johanna was ready for discharge. Now she should continue recovery as an outpatient. "We recommend staying in Austria for another 3 months, but no longer need inpatient care." Francisco rented them an apartment in central Vienna to remain close to medical help. The three of them moved in, finally enjoying something resembling a home. For the first time in many months, Elena, Johanna, and Francisco were not surrounded by hospital walls but living in a regular, though expensive, apartment in a foreign land. In the first few days, they took cautious walks through quiet streets, admiring fancy shops and Christmas displays. Winter was approaching. Elena's eyes widened with wonder at the spacious streets and fairy-tale-like buildings. Johanna walked slowly, supported by her husband, but she smiled. "I'm no longer in a hospital room. I can breathe fresh air." In the evenings, back at the apartment, Francisco read Elena bedtime stories and taught her to write letters. Over the past months, she had learned so much, more than she ever had in the orphanage. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge. Johanna lay quietly on the couch or in a chair, smiling, occasionally correcting the girl when she misspoke. Another month passed in Austria, and the doctors finally said that Johanna could return home to continue her recovery, provided all guidelines were followed. She still wasn't completely healthy but had entered a stable remission. There was always the risk of relapse, but so far, things looked good. Francisco completed all the necessary paperwork, and the day came when they boarded a regular flight home, this time the three of them, under very different circumstances. Johanna could now travel without medical equipment. Upon arrival, Francisco took his wife and daughter to his estate, a 2-story house in a guarded residential area, surrounded by firs and pines. When Elena saw the house for the first time, she gasped. "It's so beautiful. Is all this ours?" Francisco smiled and nodded. "Yes, now it's yours too." Johanna, leaning on her cane, stepped out of the car. The maid, Maria, ran to greet her, tears in her eyes. "My God, Johanna, you're walking again. I can't believe it worked." Johanna smiled, barely holding back tears herself. "Even I can't believe it." Elena ran around the house, marveling at the spacious rooms and soft carpets. When she saw the nursery that Francisco had instructed to be prepared in advance, she almost burst into tears of happiness. There were stuffed animals, a dollhouse, a beautiful dresser. A year ago, she had spent the night on a freezing street, and now she had her own room in a wealthy home and loving parents. Johanna still felt weak and tired easily. She was undergoing regular maintenance therapy. But she was no longer bedridden, she could move around, she could enjoy each day. Her hair had grown into a soft, short fuzz, but Francisco told her she was beautiful just the way she was. Elena started going out into the garden with her to feed the birds, running along the paths and collecting twigs for little crafts. They talked about many things, how Johanna remembered her childhood, how she met Francisco at a charity event, how she had always wanted children but never had the time, and then the illness struck. In just a few months, they became so close that Elena would sometimes look at Johanna and ask, "You're really my mom now, aren't you?" Johanna would nod. "Yes, sweetheart. We're finishing all the paperwork. The court will make it official soon." But even without the documents, no one doubted that Elena was their daughter. Francisco treated her with tenderness, cared for her, sat her on his lap, read her books, and took her to a child development center where she worked with speech therapists and psychologists. She needed help adjusting after life on the street. She eagerly learned and blossomed in both drawing and reading. Finally, the day of the adoption hearing arrived. Johanna, though still frail, came in person to testify that she consented, that she was healthy enough to become Elena's legal mother. The judge, having reviewed all the evidence, the medical reports, and the story of the homeless girl, made the decision. The adoption was approved. Elena officially became the daughter of Francisco and Johanna. In the courtroom, the girl smiled through joyful tears. Johanna and Francisco embraced her, and those watching were deeply moved by the sight of this family who had come such a long way. After the hearing, they returned home. Maria, the housekeeper, pulled off the white tablecloth and placed a cake on the table with the words, "Welcome to the family, Elena." The girl jumped up excitedly. "Hooray! Mama, Papa!" She hugged them both, and Johanna couldn't hold back her tears of joy. Francisco, though usually reserved, also showed his emotions. Over time, the Ponce family grew stronger. Johanna continued her treatment, periodically spending short stays at the hospital. According to the doctors, her condition was stably good, the risk of recurrence remained, but diminished with each passing month. Elena grew, attended a private preschool, and discovered the world. She was no longer afraid of dogs because a friendly, well-trained Labrador lived nearby. She no longer trembled at night because she slept in a soft bed with a beautiful blanket. Sometimes she still had nightmares about her time on the streets, but she would wake up and know everything had changed. Later, Francisco taught her to ride a bike in the garden. Johanna delighted in each new skill her daughter acquired. On warm summer days, the family went to their country house by a lake. Johanna couldn't swim actively, but she would sit at the water's edge, dipping her feet in and smiling as Elena splashed around in her inflatable ring. Francisco often joined them, helping Elena overcome her fear of the water. Whenever the three of them were together, they often reminisced about how it all began. A billionaire, desperate to save his dying wife, unexpectedly lets a homeless girl stay the night in a hospital room, assuming nothing matters anymore. And in the morning, he finds his wife showing signs of improvement for the first time in a long while. "I couldn't believe my eyes," Francisco would say with a sigh. Johanna would shake her head. "I couldn't even speak back then, but I felt it, that a child was nearby. Something clicked in me. I realized I could still be needed." Elena loved hearing that story, asking to hear it again and again. Deep down, she felt proud. She had helped her mother survive. Of course, everyone understood the vital roles played by medicine, Francisco's wealth, and new treatment methods. But the warmth of a child's small hand holding Johanna's hand had also played a powerful part. Sometimes, a child's faith can achieve the impossible. One autumn day, when Johanna was feeling stronger, they arranged a photo shoot in the park. Johanna wore a beautiful dress, Francisco a stylish suit, and Elena a festive skirt with ribbons in her hair. The photographer asked them to hug, to smile, and the photos turned out wonderful. In one picture, Elena stood between her parents, holding their hands, and both looked at her with such tenderness. When the photographer printed it out, Francisco handed it to his wife. "Look, these are your saviors. We saved you, and you saved us from despair." Johanna wiped away tears and hugged the photo to her chest. You know, I never understood why everything happened the way it did. But now I'm just grateful that it did. Papa, Elena tugged at his sleeve, tell me again about the day I came to the hospital. Francisco laughed. Elena, you've heard it so many times. Please? She fluttered her long eyelashes, and he told the story for the 100th time, how the guard had said, there's some girl running around, how he stepped into the hallway and saw you, pressed up against the wall, cold and hungry. I wanted to send you away, but something stopped me. And then? Elena always asked, though she knew every detail. And then I realized you had to stay. And you did. And for the girl, that was the most important part, she hadn't been turned away. She had found a family, a home, love. Now she had a place to return to, people to share joy and sorrow with. Life went on. As Johanna regained her strength, she returned to her passion, running a charity foundation. She helped other seriously ill people, raised funds, organized events and lectures. She often brought Elena along to meet orphans, telling them, "This is my daughter, whom we adopted. If we could do it, then other children can find families too." At first, Elena was shy, but she soon began to enjoy it, talking to the children, trying to cheer them up. Francisco returned to his large business projects, expanding the company, but now his priority was not nonstop meetings, but stability and family time. He learned to let go of work, to spend evenings reading fairy tales to Elena, helping Johanna with the foundation, discussing plans. He found true fulfillment not just in profit, but in knowing that their little family was alive and happy. Sometimes, the three of them would go to the countryside for a weekend in nature. Elena loved the chestnut alley, where she collected fallen nuts and made crafts. Johanna, savoring every moment, watched the child and thought about how doctors had predicted her death, yet here she was, drinking tea in the fresh air, laughing at her husband's jokes. Warm evenings passed in conversation, stories, and dreams for the future. Of course, Johanna's illness had not entirely disappeared. Regular checkups and tests continued, her fragile health required caution, but years had passed, and at last the doctors said, "The risk of recurrence is minimal." And every time he heard good news, Francisco remembered the eyes of that 5-year-old girl sitting in the hospital corner. Maybe everything would have been different if I turned her away, he thought, and the idea terrified him. But he had chosen kindness, and that was the key to saving them all. Years later, a photo album appeared in their home. On one of the first pages were 3 pictures, one of Johanna before her illness, smiling and full of life at a charity event, one of little Elena in the hospital, her sad eyes wide and holding a worn-out doll. A staff member had taken the photo and later given it to Francisco, and finally, a family portrait after Johanna's recovery and Elena's adoption. Under each picture, they wrote a short story. Elena loved looking through the album, tracing her fingers over the photos. Sometimes, staring at her first portrait, she would ask, "Mom, was I really that lost and unhappy?" Johanna held her close. "Yes, but even then, you had a light inside you. I felt it when you took my hand." And the girl would smile, knowing that fate had brought them together for a reason. In a conversation with a friend who once doubted that Johanna would make it, Johanna said, "You know, many people think my recovery was solely thanks to expensive treatment. Yes, of course, that was part of it. But if not for Elena, I wouldn't have held on so tightly to life. I was on the verge of giving up. And then suddenly there was this child who also needed protection. I had to fight not only for myself but for her too. I couldn't die and leave her alone again." Her friend, deeply moved, sighed. Life sometimes gives us gifts we never expect. And so it was. Francisco Ponce, a wealthy, powerful man, once rushed down a corridor to drive out a homeless girl who didn't belong there. But in that final moment, his heart softened. "She doesn't care anymore, stay if you want," he muttered, referring to his fading wife. And the next morning, he found that his wife had shown signs of improvement, and the girl became a symbol of a new life for both of them. "Now it's our family secret," he would say. We saved each other, and there was nothing mystical about it. Just love, compassion, medical help, and faith in something better. When Elena turned 10, she wrote a school essay titled My Family. She described her mother Johanna, who overcame a terrible illness because she really wanted to live and loved me like her own daughter. She wrote about her father Francisco, who was strict at first but kind, and who became the best dad in the world. Her teacher cried as she read it and gave Elena top marks. Now, the family no longer had to live at the hospital. They spent their days in their cozy home, following their own routines. Elena had friends now. But no one forgot where it all started. Sometimes, during gatherings with friends, when someone asked about real-life experiences, Francisco would tell his story, how a little girl stormed into his life at its darkest moment and helped save his wife. People would listen with genuine interest. Some might not fully believe it, might think it all sounds too much like a fairy tale. But Francisco and Johanna knew the truth. Miracles happen when just one person takes a step forward and isn't afraid to show kindness. Guests often came to visit, the same lawyers who helped with the adoption, the doctors who treated Johanna, even the security guard from the clinic who once caught Elena in the hallway. They'd sit at a big table, drink tea, chat, and look at the happy, smiling girl. And they'd remember how it all began. Francisco, the guard, would joke, "You were furious back then. I thought I was going to be fired." Francisco would laugh. "I won't lie, I considered it. But I'm glad we handled things differently." Johanna would add. "And thank goodness the girl didn't get scared and run away again." Hearing these conversations, Elena would sometimes cuddle up to her mother and smile. She understood she had been saved by a miracle. But most importantly, she now had a family. And so ends the story that began with panic and fear over a homeless girl sneaking into a private clinic, and continued as a triumph of life that no one could have predicted. Much still lay ahead: school, Elena's growing up, Johanna's continued recovery, Francisco's business ventures, new joys and new challenges. But they had a foundation, a love that was born in a hospital room. That morning, when Francisco entered and couldn't believe what he saw, the girl holding his wife's hand, and for the first time in weeks, Johanna looking lucid and trying to speak, that memory stayed with him forever. With each passing year, it didn't fade. It grew more meaningful. Because sometimes, a single small heart is enough to warm and bring back to life someone thought to be lost. And deep down, Francisco still occasionally repeated to himself the words he said that first night. "She doesn't care anymore." But maybe she did. And he was glad he didn't turn away, because what followed was more beautiful than anything money could buy. The photos from that time are carefully preserved in an album. One shows Johanna, still pale and hooked to and for, but with a faint smile. Next to her is little Elena, serious-faced, holding her hand. In the background stands Francisco, tired but with warmth in his eyes. When friends ask, "Why did you photograph such a sad moment?" Johanna replies, "That wasn't sadness, it was the beginning of our happiness." And she adds, "It doesn't matter whether a child comes from an orphanage or a maternity ward. If love and care appear in the home, everything changes." And so it did. Through pain, fear, and despair, Francisco and Johanna gained a daughter, and Elena gained a family. And not a single day spent in that hospital was wasted. Because life, when fought for with all one's might and surrounded by love, is capable of performing true, logical miracles.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.